So we are ready to start, and let me welcome our speakers of the fourth session. It's very interesting, it's very diverse, because the topic is addressing inequalities in a changing world, new models, new tools. As you can probably imagine, there are so many ways to address this topic, so what you will hear are just some examples and some suggestions of addressing inequalities in a new, original way. So, first of all, let me give the floor to Luigi Sammartino, PhD in International Law from Florence University and now working in Bologna University. He will tell us about the participation of civil society in sustainable development and fair trade, a new frontier for international cooperation.
Thank you, Mrs. Chairman. Can you hear me? Okay. It's a very pleasure to be here in Lecce, in this fantastic city, in a very sunny day, and to speak in this important and suggestive conference for speaking about some issues of democratic participation. What I will try to address in my presentation, and within this very strict period of time, is the topic of participation of civil society. First of all, I would like to address what I mean for participation of civil society. Secondly, I will address participation within sustainable development and fair trade movement and network. And finally, I will provide for the best useful tools for participation and way to participate. Finally, in my conclusion, I would like to expose what are the possible way to participate for civil society. Let me speak about very few words about participation in international law. Namely, we have no legal accepted definition of what civil society is. We have quite indications about, for example, participation of NGOs at the international level within international organizations and international courts and tribunals, so, supplying, for example, an advisory function or even some expression of a view on opinion juries. But we have to mean participation in a very broad meaning, including, for example, also participation from below or bottom-up participation. And we mean here civil society as a huge group of including any other non-state actors, like, for example, individuals, corporations and multinationals, association of categories, and any other economic actor. This is the way I will try to explain how to participate from below. And participation, I think, is could be useful addressed into three kinds of relationship between civil society and state powers. First of all is what I consider a applicative relationship of international rules and principles. A second way is a complementing or integrating relationship, where, for example, states and private actors, or civil society if you want, are working together for implementing a too general or non-self-executing principle, like, for example, sustainable development and the principles of fair trade are. These are the two that we'll address in my presentation. Let me begin from sustainable development and briefly address how participation is provided in sustainable development at the international level. in Rio Declaration of 1992, participation is variably provided. For example, in preamble are provided new forms of partnership through cooperation between states and key sector societies. As we will see, cooperation is also provided in Principle 27 between states and people. That is a compromise for indicating and for having a legal cut civil society international law and giving a legal relevance to it. Also, participation could be useful in integrating or in fulfilling a particular principle, like, for example, cooperation in eradicating poverty. So, the declaration sets the stage for a progressive relevance of the participation of non-state actors in the field of sustainable development. We can say that is a broad participation. I think it's better to say and to remain on the legal significance of the principles, that we are in a cooperation between two actors for implementing the sustainable development principles. So this is also the idea of implementation or cooperation between states and civil society. The idea of a global trusteeship between the international community, posed at the top of the triangle I show you, and between which provides principles or even international rules which states and civil society must fulfill in order to meet their legal obligations. The case of fair trade. First of all, I would like to say that there is a distinction between fair trade movement and fair trade network. The movement is the idea shared by many NGOs of fairness in trading with primary goods. In this place, the network is acting a very important role in connecting points of civil society, governments, and even international organizations for promoting the development of sustainable development principles and fair trade principles. In fair trade in particular, there is a broad space for the private initiatives to fulfill fair trade principles, the so-called game playing theory by the economists. There is also a pattern of governance of fair trade by private actors. We can call it self-governance of fair trade. Here also I provide you for a compromise. There is a private implementation, or if you want, a private enforcement of international standards and principles. Mainly, the fair trade is related to a contract between producers, sellers, and traders. So, the first applicable law is the contract law, and could rely, for example, on transnational principles in accepting determinate objects and purposes of the matter to which the contract is stipulated. Here, partnership is very relevant, for example, in addressing the allocation of resources among local communities, in particular communities in southern governments, where fair trade is more broadly accepted. Standards of fair trade. There are few standards that are very important for addressing the fair trade matter. First of all, the establishment of a minimum price that will be provided for selling products by sellers to consumers. Also, there is the establishment of a premium, which involves the sum of every sold product, and the excess of this sum, excess in respect to minimum price, is allocated for the fulfillment of social projects of the communities and for investment by the cooperatives of fair trade. Most important, there is the fulfillment with working standards. And for example, Fair Trade International, a stakeholder organization operating in the field of fair trade, especially provides for the fulfillment of ILO standards. That means no child labor, working within a given period of time, and not within, for example, an arbitrary period of time. Also, there is a democratic decision-making process among the producers, for example, in deciding how to allocate resources. Another important issue is the presence of a firmly fulfillment of transparency principle and auditing in compliance with standard of fair trade. How to respect fair trade standards? For example, with certification of fairness, which is provided by the international stakeholders, for example, Fair Trade International, which make an evaluation of the requirements owned by the single producers or traders. Also, there is an assurance phase by the stakeholder organization for the release of certification. And in this case, the assurance phase is very important to evaluate the real presence of the requirement standard. Also, there is a procedure for violation and issuing of sanctions to those sellers or producers are violating standards of fair trade. And sanctions arrive to suspension of certificate in a case of a lower violation, or even to withdrawal or decertification of the trader or the seller, where when the violation is very, very grave. Also, there is a voluntary decertification, for example, in cases where the trader or the seller is aware of its violation. There is a common and shared idea of a cooperative or collective governance in preventing risk deriving from violation of fair trade standards, instead of resorting to state government, for example, in resorting to a judge and beginning a particular procedure for issuing sanctions to fair trade violations. Governance is here intended in a very broad meaning, from the organization structure to decision on investment and allocation of resources, and also is conceived as completely independent from the government of the state, from local authorities. For example, codification of transactions are a particular case of facilitation of trade. Public-private partnership, is a very useful tool in addressing sustainable development or even fair trade principles. As provided by Principle 27, there is a preference for cooperation between states and people for ensuring the cooperation. Different pattern of public-private partnerships are in implementing different kinds of projects, from advocacy to creation of norms intending guidelines for private economic categories, financing projects, for example, as we will see, financing of providing drugs or medical drugs for some health services which cannot provide this kind of good. And also that management of sustainable development projects. Normally is considered as a contract between the government, which has a lower responsibilities than the procurement, and a private actor, which has the will to implement a sustainable development principle or purpose, and are addressed by soft law guidelines, like, for example, the UN ECOSOC resolution of 2003 or UN General Assembly resolution of 2004, which provides for the general framework within private-public partnerships are inserted. These cases, for example, is a very useful indication on the utilities of public-private partnerships. For example, donation of medical drugs by Merck and the Bill Gates Foundation to, for contrasting HIV effects in Botswana in 2008. Also, we have the project of AgriLag 2025, which provides for a platform to which free trade sellers and traders are financed in the way to fulfill fair trade principles and sustainable development principles. Private enforcement, very briefly, is a way to fulfill voluntary by private actors with sustainable development principles, and in particular with labor standards, trading fair trade goods, keeping prices low, and reallocation of resources for projects of the community, social projects. Two kinds of private enforcement are private enforcement tout court, which is the reporting of violations, for example, mainly in the fair trade area, of essential standards, and a private standard setting, which is the creation of, what can I say, a general legally relevant framework for private actors. Let me conclude with how relevant is this kind of participation in international law. First of all, we have to intend the participation as a way to implement sustainable development and fair trade principles, but is also a way to indirectly contributing in information and new rules in the development, in the future development of these principles, as also provided by the Rio Declaration. Private actors are called to fulfill these principles when states are not able or has not a will to implement in the first step these principles. And also, as I explained, as I tried to explain, the implementation process could be transformed also in a formation rule process, not a decision-making process. When these rules are provided, are formed, there is also a relevant for customer international law. For example, when states has accepted the private practice as a way to implement sustainable development principles. Otherwise, codification by private actors could amount to an indirect contribution to the formation of new principles or integration of previous principles. So, in conclusion, participation in these fields are very important first of all, for involving the private implementation and enforcement of international principles. And this is, I think, the most important step the international community has to reach. Also, the cooperation between states and private actors leads to the possibility for private actors to have a more recognized role within international law. And finally, the process of implementation could also integrate or complement principles that are not directly applicable or are too general. And finally, as a way to address an economic behavior, private enforcement and public-private partnerships with a control, as a general control by state, could address the private economic behavior and so address in fulfillment of sustainable development principles. Okay, thanks for attention, and I'll wait for your questions.
Thank you, Luigi. I think it's a great way to start because once again we see the individuals as game changers on the global stage. And we now follow with Dina Freeman. I'm happy to introduce her. She's Senior Visiting Fellow, Department of Anthropology at London School of Economics, and now Visiting Professor in Rome. And she's going to speak about the regulation of transnational corporations. What role for supranational democracy?
Okay, everyone hear me? Good, so good afternoon everyone, delighted to be here. Thank you Susanna for organising both this session and the conference, the dialogue. So I'm going to talk about the regulation of transnational corporations. And this is in a session about inequality, economic inequality, and a conference about democracy. So I'm trying to bring all these things together. So in brief, I'm going to start by asking or talking about why is democracy important? Why do we care about democracy in the first place? Okay. How does democracy link with economic inequality? Then I'm going to talk a little bit about transnational corporations, what they are, and why there's problems around the question of how to regulate them. And then I'm going to outline some history of different attempts to regulate them, because there's actually been a sort of 40 or 50-year history of people trying to regulate them through international law and as yet not succeeding. And then we'll discuss why that is and what the implications of all that are. So, why is democracy important? Why do we care? So, and why is global democracy important? So I would argue that the reason that we need global democracy is basically the same reason that we need or needed national democracy. And that ultimately that is that democracy helps to level power differences. Okay? And really my presentation is talking a lot about power and interests. Now, if we don't have any law, right, how are decisions made? Basically by the law of the jungle, by might is right, right? Whoever is physically stronger or perhaps has other forms of strength. Okay? If we have undemocratic law, we essentially have the institutionalization of might is right. Okay? Where the state has the monopoly on the means of force, and it's using that monopoly to enforce laws on people that represent the will of the leader or a small group of people around the leader. Okay? And with democratic law, we have everybody in society taking part in the decision making, if we have a kind of Athenian Greek style of democracy. And if we have a more contemporary style, we have people electing representatives who take part in that decision making on their behalf. But one way or another, and to different extents, everybody has a role and a say in that decision-making process, and they have the same amount of influence on the process. Essentially, one vote to everyone, whether you're big and strong and powerful can beat someone up, right, or very weak, or whether you're very, very rich or very, very poor, or whatever other indications of power there are. When you have a democratic system, ultimately you have one vote, everyone has the same amount of power. in the idealized version, I accept that there's degrees that happens in practice. So the key thing that I want to sort of how frame the rest of my presentation is that democracy is important because it neutralizes inequalities of power. Okay? And therefore it leads to decision making which represent a compromise between different interests and different groups within society. So when we often talk about decision making, we want to improve decision making, or we want to improve decision making at the global level as if it was a technical issue. I want to come and say, there's actually no objective measure of a better decision or a worse decision. It's about decisions that balance or don't balance the interests of different groups. Okay, so we need to be very, very aware of that. Now, to give a little bit of historical background on this, and we've heard various speakers talk about a lot of the historical backgrounds, I'm just going to run through very, very briefly a little example. But if we think about the development of democracy in Europe, now obviously it started before the 1800s, but if we start in 1800, in any one European country, approximately 2% of the male population had the vote. Okay? Women for sure didn't have the vote. And those 2%, it was based on property rights. Right? You had to have a certain amount of property to get the vote. Essentially, you were the landed gentry. You had lots and lots of property. So essentially, the rules of who had a vote was wealth, putting it crudely. And they basically participated in the decision making, and so they made decisions that made life really great for them. Okay, and here in Italy, and I've been living in Rome the last few years, you see the results of that. You see these huge palazzos and everything, right? Which is what the very small percentage were living in. Everybody else was living in a very different kind of world, right? But that's because it was the rich that were making the laws, so that was great for them. So this was a period of phenomenal economic inequality. I'll show you some graphs in a moment. But then if we rush through what happened from 1800 through to 1950, where in pretty much every European state, by that point we have universal suffrage, everybody has the vote, all men and all women. Okay. So the 1800s was a period of industrialization, a great deal of social and economic change. People were becoming pushed off the land, moving from being farmers to workers in factories. There were many, many changes going along. Workers began to organize, began to sort of try and voice their interests. Okay, and we had unions, and we had strikes, and we had ultimately the formation of a political party to represent labor. We had, step by step in most countries, the amount of property that you had to own to get the vote coming down. Right? So that gradually we got to the position where everybody had the vote. And then what happened? So then we have democratic societies. Okay, this was when we have the era of welfare states. We have education provided for everybody. We have healthcare provided for everybody. We have a system of welfare. Now, depending on your personal view, you might think, well, actually it was better when nobles lived in palaces, right? It's not better or worse. But you can see that when we had nobles living in palaces, we had the interests of their interests were represented in the decision making. And when we have all the people voting, we have a compromise. Okay? We didn't have a utopia. We didn't have a kind of communist revolution, which was there in the shadows in the background, where everything would have been equalized. But we had a compromise between the different interests in society, which made things much better for most people. And in that time, we had a major decline in economic inequality. Now, these graphs are taken from the work of Thomas Piketty, famous French economist you may have heard of. And you can see that this is in the sort of Anglo-Saxon countries, UK, US, Canada, and Australia, starting from 1900 going through to about 2010. And it's an indicator of income inequality. So you can see in 1900 we had very, very, very high income inequality, and it goes down and down and down and down till around about 1980-ish. Okay, and then zoop, starts going up again. Right? But that period from 1900 down to 1970, that's the period of increasing democracy, of welfare state, of all the things that I spoke about. Okay? And if we look at some of the other countries, the emerging, so-called emerging countries, so South Africa, Indonesia, Argentina, India, Colombia, and China, we see, broadly speaking, a similar pattern. Okay, inequality declining, and then something seems to go on in 1980 that changes the direction. And if we look at a measure of global inequality, okay, again, starting from 1950, again through to this 1980 period, it goes up, it goes down, it wobbles around, and then from 1980 something changes, and we have massive, massive, massive increase in economic inequality. So, what happened in the 1980s? Why do these graphs look like? How does this link up with our story of democracy and increasing democracy, reducing economic inequality? So, as I'm sure you're all well aware, this was the period when basically neoliberal globalization started. Okay? What does that mean? That means this is a time when capital burst free of the state and began to move more freely around the world. It doesn't move freely around the world even today, but it moved a lot more freely around the world. So as capital globalized, lawmaking and decision-making about how to govern the economy and how to regulate capital stayed at the national level. Okay, we've heard many speakers say in the last 2 days. So we have this sort of scalar problem of global economy at this level and national policy decision-making at the other level. So with no democratic lawmaking at the global level, means that we have no mechanism to balance the interests of capital and the interests of labour, of citizens, of everybody else. Okay? So the situation was very, very good for capital. So in that period from 1800 to 1950, we got a rebalancing at the national level between labour and capital, if you like, as a shorthand. And then in the 1980s, capital's expanded and sort of got itself out of that balance. And so surely the issue for us now is to how to rebalance it up at the global level. Now, there's many things that could be said here, and I'm going to just talk about one element of this, but it's an important element, and that's transnational corporations. Transnational corporations, there were only something like 10,000 of them in the 1970s, and there's now well over 100,000. So massive increase in these transnational corporations. Most international trade today, something like 80% of international trade, is carried out within transnational corporations, meaning it's different bits of transnational corporations trading with each other. Okay, roughly 80% of trade today, international trade. So what actually is a transnational corporation? It's actually phenomenally hard to define what a transnational corporation is, because there's very many different variants and different forms. But the key point, if you like, is that essentially its legal definition and its reality and practice are completely different. Okay? The legal definition is that it's more or less a network of legally separate companies that are somehow interlinked. But each company is a separate company registered in a particular country subject to the laws of that country. Okay? In practice, there's an HQ somewhere, and there's an overarching strategy for this whole group or network or whatever we want to call it, which is the transnational corporation. So in practice and economically, it is one unit. And legally, it's a lot of little different units. Why does that matter? Well, when it comes to thinking about how do you regulate these kinds of companies, it matters a lot. Because what happens in practice is that each separate company is subject to the regulation of the state in which it's based. But the whole entity is actually not subject to regulation anywhere, because we don't have a global jurisdiction for anything. So why does this matter? Well, let's say we have company A working in country X. But it transfers all of its income and other assets to a linked company, company B, which is in a different country. Okay? So it doesn't really have any assets, or very little assets, in country A where it's working. Now let's say it does a crime in country A, right? And it's taken to the court in country A, which is the only court it could be taken to. This court might find that company guilty, and might impose a fine or a penalty on this company. But if all the assets of that company are actually in country B and not in country A, and the court has absolutely no jurisdiction in country B, there's nothing it can do. Absolutely nothing it can do. Okay? And there are many, many legal cases that's happened. So the most famous one, someone alluded to it yesterday, was with Ecuador, the country of Ecuador, and the company Chevron Texaco. And it's very well known that in its oil explorations in the Amazon area of Ecuador, Chevron devastated the Amazon with awful environmental pollution, oil spills, sludge in all the rivers, toxic pollutions. Many communities have high cancer rates. It's a well-documented and rather ghastly situation. In 1993, a group of Amazonian people from this area tried to take Chevron to court. So how do you do that? So they first thought, okay, Chevron is an American headquartered company, so they tried to take the court in New York, because and for 10 years, I think, there was a legal battle between this group that represented 30,000 people of the Amazon and Chevron in New York. And for 10 years, Chevron argued, this is not the right court to take us to, you can't take us to court here. You need to take us to court in Ecuador, because we're talking about things that happened in Ecuador. Eventually, after 10 years, they won that battle, and the trial shifted to a court in Ecuador. It then carried on for a further 7 years, okay? And eventually, the court in Ecuador found them guilty and put a penalty on them for totaling almost $10 billion for compensation to the local people, for environmental cleanup of the Amazon, and so on. Chevron didn't have any assets in Ecuador. It had taken them all out a long time ago. End of story. Right? There was no jurisdiction. And to make matters worse, Chevron then took Ecuador to court through an international court, which I'll come and discuss what that means later on, through its bilateral investment treaties, suing Ecuador for various things. So this just gives an example, and it also explains why Ecuador is very active in some things I'll talk about in a moment. So it would seem obvious, right? It would seem obvious that we need a global regulatory system in international law to regulate transnational corporations. It would seem simple. Obviously we need that, right? But why don't we have it? Right, and we don't have it because we have no global democratic decision-making to balance these interests. So essentially what the transnational corporations who represent global capital want is what we have, right? To put it very, very crudely. Now, there have been historically 4 attempts to try and create an international regulatory system to regulate transnational corporations, okay? Starting from the early 1970s and until today, all right? The latest version of this process is ongoing right now in the Human Rights Council, in the UN, and it's a current and live process. So the first process started in 1974, when, let's just cut this a little bit, the Commission on Transnational Corporations was established by ECOSOC, the UN in New York, with 48 member states, with the idea to look into this business of transnational corporations, what they do, how they work, how do we make a legal system to deal with them. This was the 1970s, it's a long time ago. The world was quite different. In 1976, at its second meeting, the Commission, and essentially the Commission, remember, it means it's states, okay? It's governments who are deciding this. They established an intergovernmental working group on a code of conduct with 48 member states, the idea being that they would come and discuss and create a code of conduct for transnational corporations. So they started work in 1977, and for the first 5 years, it actually was making quite good progress. It looked quite possible. When they presented their first draft to the Commission in 1982, 2/3 of the 71 provisions in their draft were already agreed. So it really looked like they'd carry on a few more years and they're going to get there. But then, from 1984 onwards, progress stopped. Basically, the northern countries, particularly the US, blocked the process, didn't want to have any more to do with it, and people tried to keep it going throughout the 80s and eventually gave up, and in 1993 the process was terminated and the Commission on Transnational Corporations was abolished. Okay, what happened? Why did that happen? So at the start of this process, many countries were actually interested in having a code of conduct for transnational corporations. There was quite a lot of agreement that we need a code. However, the reasons that the different countries wanted a code were completely different and pulled in completely different ways. So companies from the north, right, from the global north, they wanted some kind of code that would protect their investments overseas. Okay, because this was the time, decades before that, we'd had expropriation and nationalization of assets and so on. So they wanted a code of conduct for how host governments should treat investors. Right? So they essentially wanted this code that would somehow regulate the governments of the South generally, the host governments, how they would treat investors. And furthermore, they wanted their businesses to be protected by international law, not national law, and with an international arbitration system to make sure their businesses were very, very safe. The South, however, the global South, wanted something quite different. They wanted to protect themselves from the negative impacts of transnational corporations in their countries. So they wanted a code of conduct on how transnational corporations should behave. And they wanted to make sure that these companies would be subject to national laws in their national courts. Right? Because we have essentially two different interests, whether you're the investor or you're the host country. The USSR were also involved, but they didn't have many transnational corporations, and I won't bother talking about them now. It was much more a north-south debate. So eventually it ended in deadlock, and particularly, I say, America killed it. But the reason they did this was because they got everything they wanted through a different process. So then they didn't have to bother with this one. And that different process was the thing that I alluded to earlier on, was bilateral investment treaties. A bilateral investment treaty is essentially a kind of contract between two countries, a host country and a home country, that regulates the sort of legal situation between them regarding the investment of one in the other. Now, the first one was made in 1959 between Germany and Pakistan, and they increased slowly and slowly in the 70s, a little bit more in the 80s, and then by the 1990s we have masses and masses of these bilateral investment treaties. And what they do is they create binding international law that to protect business through international arbitration and with a law that has supremacy over domestic law. Okay? Now just remember that, because that's what we wanted to have for the people against the corporations. But by the 1980s and onwards, the North had found a way to get all of that, international law protecting their businesses, and so they didn't need to bother negotiating this code anymore because they'd got what they wanted this other way. And so they pulled out. The South, of course, didn't just give up, because they spent all these years negotiating and basically got nothing. So in the late 90s, this question of how do we regulate transnational corporations popped up again in the UN. And this time the focus was on the behavior of transnational corporations, obviously not on host governments. And it was framed as a human rights issue this time, and it was discussed in the human rights part of the UN, not in ECOSOC. And initially at this point it was discussed by experts rather than by states. In 1995, a subcommission on human rights set up a working group of experts to look at transnational corporations and to work towards a code of conduct. And we had 5 experts that were academics, international law specialists from different regions of the world who came together, spent 5-6 years working on this, discussed with states, with NGOs, with lawyers, with academics, with businesses, and so on. And they came up with a really pretty good draft framework of how you could regulate transnational corporations. Okay? And this was called the norms, the draft norms of regulating transnational corporations. It was a very revolutionary document. It basically said that transnational corporations themselves are subject to obligations and have under international law, not just states. And it further suggested that there would be an enforcement mechanism through the United Nations, where NGOs and other people would be able to monitor the activities of transnational corporations, report it up to the UN, who would then have some kind of jurisdiction. It was never quite clear if it was voluntary, not voluntary, but to try and bring about change. And the clever thing within this is they thought the way that they were going to make this law work was that they would get transnational corporations to incorporate adherence to these norms in their contracts with their suppliers and subsidiaries. So it was a way of creating international law through business contract law. Now, in a way, it's not an identical mirror, but it has similarities with the bilateral investment treaties kind of route, putting it there in business law and making it. It wasn't a perfect document, but as a draft to build discussion, it was really rather excellent. So what happened? What happened to this norms? The thinking had been there. So what happened? The working group in 2003 presented it to the Subcommission of Human Rights, which is also an expert group, and they approved it. They thought excellent. The next stage is then they take it up to what was then the Commission on Human Rights, now the Human Rights Council, which is the group, the governments. And of course, all hell broke loose, right? The business community went insane, right? The International Chamber of Commerce, the International Organization of Employers, those that had all been sort of following this, came up with all manner of reasons that this was impossible and bad, and you name it, any reason they thought about it. They lobbied hard, the governments, you've got to stop this, you've got to block this, this is terrible. Many of the governments in the north who had their corporations were quite easy to be convinced. But actually, the vast majority of civil society organizations, the human rights NGOs, academics, and indeed some states from the south thought this was excellent. This is exactly what we need. So it was a big hoo-ha at the time. What happened was the lobbying was successful of the businesses. The Commission on Human Rights basically killed the norms, says it has absolutely no legal status. We didn't ask for this. It's dead. Forget about it. And instead, they nominated John Ruggie as the special representative of the Secretary General on the issue of human rights in transnational corporations and other business enterprises to look around at all the different existing things there were and basically write a report to keep everyone kind of quiet that it hasn't stopped completely. John Ruggie, as you may know, was the lead architect of the UN Global Compact, which was a kind of CSR-style voluntary thing for companies, so it was kind of clear where his perspective was and why he was chosen. And to cut a long story short, he basically came up with a voluntary code, or a voluntary kind of process, now known as the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And it's very, very conventional. It's based around protect, respect, and remedy, the idea that states, not companies or anyone else, have the obligation to protect human rights. Companies have a responsibility, whatever that means, to respect, whatever that means, human rights, and victims should have access to remedy. And while Ruggie argues that this formulation overcomes the dichotomy between mandatory and voluntary codes, because he said, well, the states should make laws. We should have basically a good network of national states making laws, and this will be good. And then we'll also have voluntary codes of conduct through the companies, and we're great. But of course, it doesn't challenge anything. The idea is that each country would make a national action plan, saying how it was going to do this and what laws it was going to make. To date, the UNGPs were accepted in 2011, so that's 7 years ago. We have 20 countries have published national action plans, so that's maybe 10%-ish of the countries in the world. Okay. Very few of them, if any really, include new laws to protect human rights, right? Which was the sort of idea of him saying that this got over the dichotomy. They're all staying in this voluntary guidelines and so on and so on. So the fourth attempt of what happened, because obviously a lot of people were not very happy that this wasn't really changing anything, and basically it's not changing anything on the ground, and the graph, you don't see any dip in the graph in any of these years. So there were three different groups of people that were getting particularly unhappy about this. First of all, were the human rights NGOs, who'd been involved in the process of the norms, involved in the discussions about the UNGPs, had many legal specialists and very serious suggestions of how you could regulate transnational corporations. Then you had Ecuador, that was going through that ghastly legal battle that I was talking about, and was becoming very aware of this imbalance of binding law that protected the rights of investors, and yet only these soft laws that actually had no power in court and no appropriate court anyhow to protect human rights or the environment or people in any way. And at the same time, you also had a grassroots network of social movements, okay, including peasant groups, indigenous groups, women's groups, communities affected by the impacts of transnational corporations, right, like the Amazonian group from Ecuador, that were beginning to come together and discuss things at the World Social Forum, at other meetings, okay, and they were all discussing what are our common problems. And it was amazing how one of the common problems, that whether you were a peasant in Africa or some indigenous group in the Amazon, that many of these groups faced was the negative impact of transnational corporations on their lives. And so in 2012, this massive kind of interconnected transnational social movement launched the global campaign to dismantle corporate power and end impunity, which basically they would like to do what it says on the tin. And this included a demand for a binding treaty to regulate transnational corporations. So we've got all these different stakeholder groups coming together. They basically spoke to Ecuador, and also South Africa were interested for other reasons. And in 2014, Ecuador and South Africa called for an intergovernmental process to create a binding treaty to regulate transnational corporations again, okay? And this resolution was passed, and this started. In 2014, this massive global campaign, and the NGO, the human rights NGOs, got together to form an even bigger transnational alliance called the Treaty Alliance, okay, to push for there to be a treaty. So, 2015, the Intergovernmental Working Group has its first meeting. So we're back to the 70s, okay? We're back to the 70s with an intergovernmental process to discuss how do we regulate transnational corporations. Context is very different now from in the 70s, okay? We've had all these processes and all these experts and all these lawyers, so there's a lot of learning from the previous processes. There's also, as I said before, a massive increase in the number of transnational corporations in the world, many more than there were in the 70s. There's also the fact that there's also a growth in transnational corporations headquartered in the global south, okay, in emerging economies in India, China, and Russia, and Argentina, Brazil, and so on. About 30,000 transnational corporations are now headquartered in the south. So, and we've also had this massive growth of NGOs and social movements that are now forming transnational connections, which didn't have in the 70s. So it's a very different context, the debate that's happening now, than it was then. Then, in the 70s, it was largely between home countries and host countries, right? North and South. Now, really, it's between business and civil society. Except none of them actually have a vote, right? The states are the ones who are having the vote, but really the discussion is between transnational corporations and civil society. Between these corporations that pollute the Amazon and the people that are living in the Amazon that got polluted, and so on and so on. And it obviously has a strong left and right issue, because your values and where you're going to stand, of where your interests are, is very much fitting into a traditional left-right pattern that we have at a national level, but is now at a global level. Okay? And of course, Ecuador, under the government of Correa, and now Moreno, is a left-wing government. So also what the national left-right is influencing these discussions. The global campaign is calling for something very similar to the norms, direct obligations on companies and so on. And what's happening in this intergovernmental working group is that many of the northern countries are not even taking part, because there's no obligation, of course, right? It's all UN, it's all voluntary, it's all open. So US, Canada, Japan, many others of the northern countries are just not in the room, not interested. The EU and its member states are, but are very anti the process, because what have they got to gain from it? Not really anything. The business, the International Chamber of Commerce and other business representatives are there lobbying hard for this process not to go anywhere. And then you have this massive group of civil society and people from the Amazon who are all coming into Geneva and making their case that it should go somewhere. So where that's going to go, I don't know. It's something that I'm following as a researcher and that I want to see. In terms of our question about democracy and global democracy, I think we can see that the reason we haven't up till now been able to find any way to regulate transnational corporations is because there's no democracy in the process, and therefore might is right and they have the power. We now have a process with a huge amount of civil society there, and they are trying to democratize it. And many speakers in this conference have really tried to emphasize how having civil society helps make these decisions more democratic. And I would say, yes, it helps. It's a step in the right direction, but it's not nearly enough. It's not the solution. Because having civil society there and these social movements gives people a voice, right? They're heard. They all come to Geneva and testify, basically, of what's happened in their territories and their countries. But they don't have a vote. So they're ignorable, okay? The alliance of the social movements and the NGOs they're aware that democracy is the key issue here, and they are trying to democratize the process further as much as possible. And one of the main ways they've been doing it has been trying to get parliamentarians from different countries involved in the process. Because of course the UN only has governments, which means the opposition parties are not part of the process. So, for example, they have created now a network of parliamentarians in support of the treaty, and there's 1,000 or 2,000 parliamentarians from different parts around the world who've signed on to this. And the idea being that then these parliamentarians can also raise the issue in the national parliaments, and then there's a sort of some kind of democratic debate in the countries or in the regions. And this is happening, and it's causing embarrassment because, for example, the EU Parliament has passed several resolutions in favour of a binding treaty. The position of the European Parliament is in favour of the treaty. The position of the European negotiators in the UN is strongly against. Okay? So this tactic of bringing parliamentarians and having parliamentary resolutions highlights to people the lack of democracy and how what the people want when they have some kind of say is quite different from what the governments are asking for. But it still doesn't actually solve the problem, because at the end of the day, those that are sitting there in the UN have the vote and all the others don't. So, okay. Yeah, I'm a last sentence. I just want to say that, really the only way I think that we will ever get, we will be able to pass some sort of global regulation on transnational corporations if we really democratize global decision making. That's really the fundamental only way. And the only way to change that graph is to do that. Thank you.
I'm happy to give the floor now to Andrea Pedicati, engineer, co-founder and CEO of AR Dream, a startup in the aerospace field, right?
Additive manufacturing.
The fourth industrial revolution and its technologies, a global challenge. We hope to hear some words of hope after all this.
No.
No?
So I'm going to talk about the fourth industrial revolution and its technologies. But first of all, I would really like to know who between you knows we are in the fourth industrial revolution. Just
in the what?
Yeah.
In the fourth industrial revolution. Yes, there were four. We are gonna.
I was in the third.
Where's the third? So you have no idea which technologies can be in this revolution. Well, I will try to show you that yes, there is a new industrial revolution that started, and why. I will try to convince you that this is important in a dialogue about this supranational democracy we are having here, because I call it a global challenge. And we will see, you will hear something, and you will recall also something that you heard in these 2 days from another point of view, from like a technological point of view, what's happening in the world. Okay? Let's close this. So yes, this is the fourth industrial revolution. What is nice about the industrial revolution is that usually there is the same path. Okay? There is like a disruptive, innovative technology coming on. Someone invented it, and then someone else is using it, usually in the manufacturing or the industrial sector. Why? Because only in this way this innovation, these innovative technologies can enter in the society. So someone is using it to produce things, and when someone is using it to produce things, entering the industry, this is going to change the way of people works. This is going to change our society. And it happened in the past. And what I noticed is that usually this was the path. There was an invention. Someone was using it mainly to make money. Then there was a change in society. Workers start to facing some issues, some benefits and some issues. And just at the end came the politics. Maybe trying to do some regulation, maybe when it was too late, or maybe don't even caring about. the first industrial revolution, we all know about it. The main technology was the steam power, basically. So it was more than 200 years ago. The second industrial revolution, the disruptive, innovative technology, was basically electricity and another idea, the idea of mass production and assembly line. And this you can see that when you entered in the industry, it radically changed the way of people were working and how to react. The third industrial revolution was about microprocessor, was about computers. We all experience it in this room, I think. In fact, probably it's not even ended, even if in this slide, it's the third one, okay, it was written still second. I say then in 1990, but we are all living with computer, what happened, all the change. Well, in the first three industrial revolution, there was always one innovative technology going to impact on a special sector of our life. What is different about the fourth industrial revolution is that there is not just one innovative technology, there is a full set of new technologies, we are going to see them, and this set is having an impact on all aspects of our life. It's not just in the production system, it's everywhere. This is why I believe it's important to talk about it, it's important to know what's going to happen. And now we are going to see which kind of technology I'm talking about, and you will start to recognize them. And then we will see how they really are going to changing our world and why their impact is so disruptive, I believe. So, those are the 9 key technologies of the so-called fourth industrial revolution of Industry 4.0 that maybe someone else of you start hearing about. And you can recognize some of them for sure. We have additive manufacturing, we have advanced manufacturing solution, which is producing with robots. We have augmented reality and virtual reality. And then a lot of set that is going to impact on our life in everyday life. Cloud system, Internet of Things, simulation, big data analysis, cybersecurity, and integration. Okay, there are a lot, I can understand. But maybe we can put some organization, we can put our mindset to this technology and see that basically there are 3 technologies that have a very huge impact on the manufacturing. I put them all in the advanced manufacturing, which is basically an automatic system of manufacturing, which is integrating a new way of manufacturing, which is the additive manufacturing, which is creating things, producing things, manufacturing things in a new way. Okay, all the new things are manufactured layer by layer from the bottom to the top. So you create just one piece of everything. You don't need to create a lot. You don't need to create a mass production to have the right way to sell them. And then there is robotics, of course, that is entering, but the integration between robotics, additive manufacturing, augmented reality, and virtual reality is making a new way of production smart. What is smart? What means being smart? Smart or intelligence, let's say, is the way to adapt to changes. When something is changing, you need to adapt. Most of the systems we are surrounded today, they are stupid. They are not smart. But they are selling us a lot of smart devices right now. No? Or smart, if you put smart before a TV, if you put smart before a mobile phone, of everything, they are selling us something smart. But what is really smart? Well, in production, smart is not just starting a production and producing a million things. It's adapting to the environment, adapting to what is happening, seeing what's happening in real time. And this is going to change the way of production. It's going to change the way of people will work and also the competencies needed. Yesterday, someone says that probably 85% of the work in the next 20 years, we will have no idea what they will be. Probably a lot of jobs will disappear and a new one will appear because of this new need of competencies. Because there is no comparison between this new way of manufacturing and the old way. The second set is going through what is called a cyber-physical systems. If you didn't hear about this, just set your memory on it, because you will hear a lot in the next future. And this is comprising a lot of technology, and this is entering in our life. It's already in our life, and I will show it to you. What is a cyber-physical system? A cyber-physical system is a system where the physical world, the one we experience, and the digital world are not two separate worlds. They are two worlds that can combine each other, acquire some data, some input, give some output, and also give some action to do. There is a full integration between this physical world and this digital world. How is working? It's working, for example, collecting data. Or with all our smart devices, they are all starting to integrate our physical world with the digital world. No one is understanding anything of what I'm saying, probably. But, okay, let's try and make an example, okay? Everybody knows about smart house, probably. You heard about that we will have a lot of new devices to have a smart house. Well, in some countries maybe are more advanced, in some other less. My house is pretty stupid. So I had a serious issue a couple of weeks ago, because while I was sleeping in the house, a pipe behind the basin suddenly broke, and all the water started to flow in the house. And I was sleeping, and I couldn't realize, probably before 1 hour that happened, when all my houses was flooded with water. Why? There was no way to do that. No, there was a change in the system, because everything was built in a certain way, a pipe broke, and the water started to flow. And my house is stupid. There was no way to adapt to that change. But let's see, I'm really going like this, because we can imagine what we can do to make an house smart, okay? So, for example, for this situation, we can put some sensor on the floor that they can understand if there is water on the floor. And they are sending maybe this message to the cloud. No? They are connected to our Wi-Fi at home, and they are doing it. Then we have our mobile phone. They are always connected. They are always sending messages to the cloud. They know when we are in the house. They know when we are sleeping. They know when we are going outside, right? It's very easy. When you're sleeping, you're not connecting to WhatsApp, probably, for 8 hours. So they know you're sleeping. Then they have a GPS, you're going outside your house, and they know you're outside the house. So they are sending messages to the digital world, okay? We are in our physical world, and we are sending messages to this digital world. A smart system, what is doing? A smart system probably is reading the sensor on the floor, is realizing there is something different, because there is water. Why there is water? Where is Andrea? Andrea is sleeping, it's 2 in the night, so he's not connected to WhatsApp in the last 3 hours, so most probably he's sleeping. He also set the sleeping on his iPhone to be woken up after 7 hours. So he's not moving, his mobile is not moving, he's not taking his mobile with him. So he's sleeping, something is wrong. Well, a smart system is taking an action, because maybe there is a controller on the central control of the water system, and it's closing the water. Maybe it's taking an action without even asking. Because Andrea, maybe before, told, look, if you notice something wrong, just do that. And so it's closing the water, and I won't spend 3 hours in the middle of the night trying to solve the problem. Or in winter, for example, when we are cold, no? We all have these thermostats to regulate the temperature, the heating system in our houses. There are more and more smart systems like this. What they are doing, they are connecting with your mobile phone, they are checking when you are coming back home, and maybe they start the heating system. And when you enter home, the house is warm, and maybe you're also saving some money, because they can manage that. So there are a lot of input that now we can send from our physical world to the digital world. A smart system, a cyber-physical system, as a digital world that can interact, can adapt to change, and can take some action, or inform us so we can take some action. It can be scary, I don't know, but someone thinks it's scary. I like to see the nice point of view. This is how the technology can be useful to us, even it's maybe a little invasive. So I hope that now you have a better idea of what a cyber-physical system is. This is gonna grow a lot, that's for sure, because those are disruptive technologies, and the people managing that, they want to make money out of it. So they will make a lot of money out of it. Okay, so this is why the fourth industrial revolution is not only a technological process, it's a complex transformation, and there's social, and there's also political consequences. I don't want to go on and on, so I just selected the 3 cases. I'll give you more example, and we'll see why, with the conclusion, maybe we need to talk about this in the supranational democracy. So first of all, the big data, collect and mining. What is the big data? It's everything we send to the cloud. They know everything about us, because with our mobile, probably we send to the cloud all our information. I told them before, they know when we're sleeping, because we are not moving our mobile and we are not connecting to the internet. And all this big information, if someone is able to process them, there can be big issues, of course, because someone can exploit them for profit, and it's already happening. But someone, for example, could exploit it also for political outcome. And I mean, it's been 2, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. When was the Cambridge Analytica scandal? What is that? It's just exactly the same thing. Facebook is collecting big data. They are using the big data in a smart way. They are analyzing, they are taking the information, and they are trying to take some action to modify the political outcome of an election of the most powerful country in this planet. I mean, we are not talking about, something happening just in a city or somewhere. So, of course, those technologies can also create a personal dependence on new technology. You need this technology. Why? Yesterday someone told me, all my life is on this mobile, I need internet connection, otherwise what can I do? So we are always connected, and we are maybe always on a social media interaction, and we are forced to that. We'll see more later. So there can be also needs created ad hoc, needs created just so that they can sell us things and keep on going with this. This is of course, we are talking again about large corporation exploit of big data. And we go back to some risk of this digital life, okay? Because if you notice it, now we really are always connected. We are connected in our private life, social life. We are connected as workers. We are connected as consumer. And then as citizen, as human, no? As citizen, more and more cities are sending information through some channels, so you get on your mobile your information. We in the private life, we all use social network probably, but there are also social network for when we work, not only for our private life. And there are social network when we go on holiday, we take pictures or whatever. So they try to get us. They try to get us is a little bit bad. Okay, let's say we want it. We are always connected, but being always connected, we create this big data profile. And this big data is taking all the human action, interaction, reaction, transaction, of course. No, I pay with my mobile. Now, sometimes people are looking at me in a strange way. What are you doing? I want to pay with my mobile, but that's recorded in everywhere, from my credit card, from my bank, from my supermarket, from my mobile, from Apple, for everyone. Probably also they can create big data on our thoughts, on our desire. No? When we search on internet, maybe, and our search history is going to the cloud. So when we search on a laptop, then we can continue on our mobile. What are we doing? We are just sending this big data. And of course, this big data can be quantified, recorded, and used basically for profiling. And on the left side, I make a small example of what can happen. Because an example with social network, for example. most of us or all of us embrace social networks, social media. Through the big data and the profile, the appeal of social media is increasing. And so there is almost a certain social pressure and obligation. This can be a topic to analyze, for example, how this there is a pressure to use the social network. You don't have Facebook, you don't have, I don't know, Twitter, you don't use them. Why? What do you have to hide? So we embrace the social media and we enter in a circle where we are forced to, in this circle, to do all the social media wants in this case. And then, of course, there is a more serious aspect, which is the one of the Industry 4.0, which, of course, these kind of technologies cannot be developed by anyone. They need a huge amount of money, they need a huge amount of time, and possibly years-long research and investment. So who can do this? Large corporation or huge multinationals or government, national government or supranational government? Because this Industry 4.0 also take with this an hyper-automatization, hyper-connectivity, and little geographic barriers, because you can now, always being connected, you can really move along, create clusters or not, and produce whatever you want. So the fact that this development, this technology could be in the hands of large corporations surely was a problem on how they're going to use it or on what's going to happen. So I'm going to rush through the conclusion. So in my opinion, with this fourth industrial revolution we started just a couple of years ago, there are at stake political and social issues. And the effect will spread on all social dimension and also on individual level. So this process, of course, involves different social, political, economical, and cultural actors. Just because what I said, if technologies are developed by large corporations only, if there are no regulation, that can be a bad issue. But I believe it is possible to imagine and to design new policies, and what better than some supranational democracy or supranational institution able to do that. So I believe the positive outcome will depend on how we will address on a political side these issues on a planet scale. We cannot think about it on a local scale, we cannot think about it on a national scale, we must think about a planet scale. So I just put some suggestions. I believe there is a need to promote a cultural change. I'm here asking, I started asking you, do you know about the fourth industrial revolution? Do you know about this technology? If you don't know about them, you don't know how to put the technology at your service and not be dominated by them, not be used by them. So we need to understand what's happening on a more complex level, so that technology is compatible also with the needs of societies. Of course, not only cultural change is enough. We should develop some policies, because technology really has the power to empower us, to free our creativity, or to make a better life of our life. But for sure we need some policies, and we need them on a planet scale. And of course also some monetary organizations. I think that's the need, because the risk for democracy on a local level or on a supranational level is that if technology is in the hands of few companies or few big companies, and we can all name some of them, right? Google, Microsoft, Facebook, they are all using this technology, and they are, so Apple, they are so big that we can compare them to big nations, not even to small countries. We can compare them to big countries in terms of GDP. So if you want to avoid also this risk for a democracy, also for a supranational democracy, I think we should also think about conceiving policies and monitoring organization, not only for all the issues you address in these 2 days, but also for the technology issues. This is, I believe, and this is what I told you today. Thank you very much.
Now we have Ignazio Tredici from Judicial Affairs Officer at UN, Justice and Correction Standing Capacity, and he's going to speak about innovative approaches to the fight against impunity for the commission of international crimes in post-conflict contexts. You have the floor, Ignacio.
Thank you to everyone. Extraordinary presentations today. I really enjoyed. I was wondering, when are we going to have the chance to read some of them? Dina, I just asked her, when are we going to have the chance to read your presentation in a book? Excellent, thank you very much. So, how does my subject fit in this very interesting, eclectic, baroque, rich discussion? Well, I believe this is the way it fits here. There's no chance for peace, security, human rights, democracy, economic or social development to thrive without the rule of law. In fact, this is one of the premises upon which the Department of Peacekeeping Operations of the United Nations based its work. On this one, on the fact that legal obligations of the international community to prosecute international crimes has to be upheld by everyone, in particular by us. Then, well, I would also like to say that we're not only working and supporting the prosecution of international crimes, but also crimes that impact the most on peace and stability, including other serious crimes that might fuel conflict. So we assist countries, post-conflict states, in combating organized crime and corruption. I work in Brindisi for the Justice and Corrections Standing Capacity. From there, I deploy to different post-conflict states to work on rule of law issues. And I will discuss a number of projects I've been working on in the last 4 years since I got here. What I've seen, and I don't have the time to discuss it today, but I'll just throw it and then maybe we can discuss it later, is what I see a change, a sort of change of paradigm from supranational prosecution to national prosecutions. So from the ICC, and I started working in the field of international criminal law at the end of the 2000s. By 2004, I was already working at the Rwandan Tribunal as a prosecutor. So I sort of surfed the wave of the ICC being established and being created, and I was a previous witness to the work of the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Tribunal for Rwanda. But I see now that for a series of reasons, the prosecution of international crimes and other crimes that impact on the peace and stability of the world, the peace of stability in post-conflict situations, is going back to national authorities. So I will discuss today briefly 4 innovative projects, innovative in a way, run by the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations. This is the establishment of a special criminal court in the Central African Republic, the prosecution support cells project in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the design, the assistance that is being provided to the South Sudanese authorities for the design of alternative accountability mechanisms for South Sudan, given the lack of political will to establish the hybrid court that have been agreed in the peace agreement between the 2 warring parties, and the redeployment of justice in Darfur, the project or the support for the redeployment of the system of administration of justice in Darfur. Finally, I will mention other DPKO projects of assistance to combat impunity for serious crimes. And there's no clear definition of what serious crimes means. When I say serious crimes, I refer to international crimes and other serious crimes that, as I said before, as I mentioned before, have a serious impact on peace and stability, particularly in post-conflict states. Those could be organized crime and could be corruption, and I'll discuss them later briefly. So this is a Central African Republic. You might or might not be familiar with the conflict there between two and other groups, but mainly two groups: the Christians, anti-Balakas on one side, and the Muslims, Selekas, on the other side. It's been a terrible conflict. I've been trapped in that conflict. I survived because I was working there at one of the heights of the conflict, as being on and off for a while. So I deployed to Bangui back in 2014 to assist in the drafting of the statute for the establishment of the Special Criminal Court for the Central African Republic, which is the first time that the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, that in fact is mostly staffed by soldiers and what we know as blue helmets, peacekeepers, development, or people working on development. So it's the first time that DPKO assists a country in the establishment of what we call a hybrid court. The criminal court, the Special Criminal Court for the Central African Republic, in fact, is a national court that works within the judiciary of the Central African Republic, and is supported by international staff that is being provided to the Special Court with the support of the MINUSCA, which is the mission of the United Nations, stabilization mission of the United Nations in the Central African Republic. It applies national law. I have to say that they have a rather advanced penal code that incorporates corporate liability, corporate criminal liability, which is not something that we criminal law lawyers see very often, in particular in Africa. But can apply this Special Criminal Court in the case of absence of rules. So in case of legal lacuna, they can apply international jurisprudence from the ad hoc tribunals from the ICC. They can apply international principles and international standards as well. So it's coordinated, the establishment of this court is coordinated and supported by MINUSCA, the mission, UNPOL, United Nations Police, that is now stationed there for 4 years, UNDP, United Nations Development Program, UN Women, and other international donors that have, like France, for example. I mentioned France because it's an important donor in the Central African Republic in particular. And another feature of interest is that international defense lawyers could be called, even though it's a national court, strictly speaking, it's a national court, applying national law with sort of national and international judges and prosecutors. Still, for some complex cases, the rules provide that international lawyers can go there to take cases to defend suspects or accused persons. So this is, in 2 words, the work that we've done, DPKO has done in the Central African Republic to help address impunity for the terrible crimes that have been committed there. Now we move to Congo. Well, you might or might not have heard, might or might not be familiar with the first and the second civil war in Congo and the impact that the spillover of the war in Rwanda in the 90s and other conflicts in the Great Lake regions has had in the peace and security situation in Congo. Not only that, but also they are unlucky to be extremely rich. I'm sure you've heard about coltan, and you know you know about the trafficking of natural resources, the bloody trafficking of natural resources in the northeast part of Congo in particular. Well, there's a case from the ICC that has been going on for years and years in respect of crimes committed in the area of Ituri and the northeast part of Congo. So what we did is we came up with a project to support the military, because they are the ones in Congo that have jurisdiction. Things have changed since 2013, that have jurisdiction over international crimes, being international crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Basically, we've taken their number of experts. We've created these cells of experts in the investigation and prosecution of international/organized crime to support the military. Since 2012, we've been there. We've co-located our staff at prisons and courts and offices of the local prosecutors, as long as it was agreed with the national authorities. And the results have been rather positive, because we've seen an increase in the number of cases that have been adjudicated by military courts. And there's a long debate about military courts running this sort of cases. I will not get into this now. There's also a problem, there was also a problem that was posed to the UN, which was the one that the Congolese criminal code provides for the application of the death penalty. There's a moratorium for years, and in practice it has not been applied for years. But the result of this provision of support, or this support that we provided to the Congolese authorities, has been rather positive, in that there's been an impact that we have been able to measure in terms of numbers of cases adjudicated and the improvement in the application of the law and the adjudication of the cases. I'll move to South Sudan. I was in South Sudan last year. Last year. Well, again, you might or might not be familiar with the situation in South Sudan. There are basically two main warring factions, the one that is in power and another one that has been fighting to seize power. There was a peace agreement. This peace agreement has not been respected by the parties. There's a mechanism to control the disarmament and demobilization of forces. It's not being very successful. The conflict is still alive in South Sudan. And of course, as you might guess, this has drained the resources, it has depleted the resources, not only material, but essentially human resources available to dispose of cases of this nature, of judges, prosecutors, investigators. They've been killed, or they fled, or they are not available. So we are now coming up with alternatives to offer to the government of South Sudan to fight impunity for the commission of these terrible crimes that have been committed, that have been perpetrated there in South Sudan. The conflict, as I said, is still alive, and the local authorities have shown no political will to establish the hybrid court as mandated by the peace agreement. And so we thought of trying to apply to the South Sudanese context project that is similar to the prosecution support cells, in that we might provide them with support from international experts on the investigation and prosecution of cases, but it will be a purely national effort in that we will not provide any other but technical support, not actual judges and prosecutors. We're talking about contexts where resources are almost inexistent. So places where the big extensions of territory where conflict prevails and there are no magistrates, there's no police, there are no prosecutors, there are no ways to investigate or to prosecute or to be able to break the cycle of violence, and or even to de-escalate the disagreements between, and we've seen this a lot in Darfur, where I worked last year as well. I went there to work in a project for the redeployment of state authority. I'm sure you've all heard about the Darfur genocide. Well, the consequences of that civil war and the genocide that happened are still there, and they've not been addressed in most cases. In Darfur, the Sudanese government has set up a special court to deal with international crimes committed in the region. It's not, I mean, it's operational, but it's not as diligent as the international community would like to see it working. There are many areas, it's a huge region. There are many areas where there's no system of administration of justice, so we've been trying to, I deployed to Darfur for 4 months last year to identify the resources that were available, the needs, so to establish priorities and be able to give advice on where to take judges and prosecutors, where to rebuild or rehabilitate prisons, where to take traditional judges. I was talking a second ago, and I didn't finish my phrase. I was saying that another aspect or interesting solution that we've provided is the redeployment of traditional justice to de-escalate intertribal, inter-ethnic conflicts that otherwise might escalate into live conflict. So traditional justice, even though it doesn't always apply what we know as international standards, they still play a significant, a very important role in the de-escalation of conflict in these sort of contexts. So we have to rely on them to be able to bring peace and or improve the security situation in this sort of situation. So I mentioned there that we technically support the work of the prosecutor of the special court for the food crimes. It's been a fight because there's not much political support for the special prosecutor, and as I said before, it's not being as diligent as he has been expected to be. We've been working on the rehabilitation of prisons, courts, and police stations in different places in Darfur. We prioritize the protection of the most vulnerable, refugees, women, children, particularly targeted groups. And I move to the next slide, and I stop here. I know that we don't have time. So we have other projects where we provide assistance to fight impunity for other crimes that are not international crimes as we know them. So genocide, war crimes, all crimes against humanity, but are crimes that had a serious impact on the security situation. So in Afghanistan, we've been very active in supporting projects to implement a mechanism to fight corruption. So we provided technical assistance to work on the legal engineering required to pass the laws, so to draft the laws, to have them accepted and passed by Parliament, and then to implement them. And now we're in the phase of controlling and monitoring what is the result of the implementation of these new mechanisms to fight corruption. Same thing in Somalia and in Mali. And well, I can give you more details if required. And I close here. And I hope it was interesting. Not as much as Dina's. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. It's a pity not having enough time to go deeper on all these interesting topics. So while Domenico De Marinis and Sara Cavagnero are preparing their presentation in the PC, I will say a few words trying to make sense of such a diverse and rich session. We started with fair trade, with Luigi, and the role for civil society. Then we saw rising inequality due to the existence of multinational companies in a globalized world with Dina. How this inequality could increase with the fourth industrial revolution with Andrea. And now the importance of the rule of law, which has been stressed by everybody in the session. So the rule of law, not only at the global level, but also at national level where it is missing, because we forget that sometimes it is even missing at national level. And now we go again to fair trade with Domenico De Marinis and Sara Cavagnero. Domenico is an adjunct professor of fashion law and intellectual property law, he's a lawyer. And Sara is an humanitarian diplomacy officer working with the Italian Red Cross. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Caffaro, and thanks to the University of Salento for hosting this dialogue. And thanks for the timing too, because it's really perfect, as this is the Fashion Revolution Week, when all over the world we celebrate and we remember actually the tragedy of Dhaka in Bangladesh, when the Rana Plaza building collapsed, causing the death of over 1,000 people that were working in the fashion industry. So before starting my presentation, I want to tell you a story. It's a story of a young scholar who was invited to speak at a very important conference, an international one in Lecce. So her first thought when she knew that she had to speak in public was, oh my God, what am I going to wear? So she goes to a shop willing to buy nice clothing. There is not just good on her, but also good for the planet. And she finds a light blue jacket, and she wants to find information about it. So she looks at the label, and she cannot find any information on the sourcing of the garment, on the production methods, nothing. So she goes to the sales assistant, and she asks those information again. And she receives some general answers, and at the end she says, why do you care? Light blue is the color of the season, so just buy it. So she goes to the website of the company because she's very skeptical, and she finds a lot of information at this point about the CSR practices, about the commitment, about certification that the company has. But it's very hard for her to understand, and it takes so much time, and the sales assistant is waiting. So in the end, she decides to buy the jacket because light blue is the color of the season. But she couldn't really understand and separate the marketing claims of the company from the real ethical standards embodied in such garment. So the paradox is that we live in a world of information. We have information all the time coming from everywhere, but what we lack is reliable information on the so-called credence attributes. What are credence attributes? They're qualities and features of a product that cannot be experienced directly by the consumer, but they're very relevant to make an ethical choice, a choice that is sustainable. So those information concern sourcing of components. So as Mr. Tredici highlighted, do these little stones that embellish my dress come from trafficking of natural resources? We don't know. Characteristics of components. So which dye was used to make this light blue jacket? Am I allergic to it? I don't know. What about the processing and manufacturing practices? Where was this cloth made in sweatshop conditions? So more in general, we lack information about the supply chain in the fashion industry. And this is because the supply chain can be as complicated as this. So involving so many stakeholders, over thousands of stakeholders, even for small fashion companies. The fashion supply chain goes from the raw material production to the stores, the offices, the warehouses, the office of the designer. And it changes from season to season, from designer to designer. And the season nowadays, you may think there are 4, but they're increasing. In the fashion industry, there are 6. And there are companies such as Zara or H&M that produce and introduce to the market new garments every week. So how to handle these difficulties? Supply chains, you must remember, work more or less like social networks. So the informations are there, but they're only visible to some of the tiers and not to all of them. So generally, raw material processors know the source and information about the raw material production, but those information do not reach the very end of the chain, so they're not downstream to the final consumer. And there are several initiatives to tackle this transparency and solve this lack of transparency, and solve the issue. First of all, initiatives come from the companies themselves. So from the last report published this year by McKinsey, we understood that 42% of fashion companies disclose supplier information. Here you have the example of Everlane, that is a US brand, which endorsed a campaign called transparent pricing. So it gives information about the price of materials, the price of the transport, the impact of such stages of the production. But transparency concerning just this little stage of supplier information is not enough. It is not the end of the game. It's just a mean to put the spotlight on some issues that are normally left in the dark. But we need more pervasive change. We need an entire change in the whole system. And NGOs and social movements, as Professor Dina Friedman pointed out, are very useful and committed to this goal. So they do independent monitoring, they rate supply chain, they develop standards, and they're very active, and their voice is spread through social media. And a recent publication by the Journal of Clean Production tried to measure the impact of the NGO's campaign and found that actually they do have a great influence on consumers' purchasing behaviors. For example, the detox campaign that was started by Greenpeace in 2011 and is still ongoing actually determines some consumers not to buy clothes produced by Zara, for example. But the voice of the NGOs can also be ignored. Indeed, they also found that to reduce the negative effects and to restore the purchases, it was just sufficient for the brands to commit to eliminate the causes of the scandal. Not even doing anything, just committing. Finally, we have certifications. So certifications, again, can be very useful because they provide information on, for example, child labor or wildlife-friendly practices, and so on and so forth, that cannot be experienced directly by consumers. But can anybody tell me the difference between the Better Cotton Initiative standards and the Organic Cotton Association standards? Well, I can't even tell you the differences because they're so complicated and so technical. They involve capacity building strategies, they involve percentage of chemicals that are allowed the soil use, the biodiversity preservation, and so on and so forth. So they're very complicated to understand by consumers, and they're not sufficiently disclosed to the buyers. And also, from an equality point of view, they can hinder smallholders' participation due to the substantive costs. So smallholders that might be very sustainable and produce organically might not afford to pay the certification institutions to have a recognition of their work. So how do we address all these challenges? Where do we start from? The fourth industrial revolution, first of all, can help. So we have, for example, the blockchain technology that can be very useful, and it's been used in this pilot project by the startup Provenance, together with the London College of Fashion, who developed a blockchain-based label and tag that they put in all the clothes designed by this designer, Martin Jargaard from the Netherlands. And it's a pilot project. She is a very small designer. She has a small supply chain, but they managed to follow the product from the farm where the cashmere was developed until the very end of the production, influencing the designer practices and choices. On the same line, we see that Avery Dennison, that is the biggest label producer in the world, is using new technologies and engaging in creating immutable digital profiles on the blockchain and put them in labels. And finally, we have some initiatives from the industry, such as the HIG Index, that was developed by the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, and that gives measurable criteria for addressing sustainability performance, assessment, reporting, and it's really widespread among the industry, and it seems that it's becoming slowly a generally adopted global standard. But we're lawyers, so we thought, okay, how can we address all these changes? How can we use them in a context that, as Professor Friedman mentioned before, is so complicated, where regulating multinational corporations seems quite impossible. So can we move within this legal framework, within this global governance, and find a solution that works? So our starting point was, well, consumers' decisions are based on brands. They decide whether or not to buy some clothes, looking at the brand and say, okay, I'm buying Gucci, okay, I'm buying Zara. So we said, if those brands can convey information about the quality, origin, and so on of the goods, why can't they convey information about sustainability too? So we came up with this solution that goes, a process that goes from trademarks to trace marks. So what are trace marks? They're a hybrid. They combine the traditional functions of trademarks, so distincting function, advertising function, with the function that is normally related to certification, so quality and origin. Then we had to come up with a solution on how this trademark should work. So we thought that in order to have a system that allows the engagement of all the actors and connects every step of the supply chain, we needed a multi-stakeholder platform. So we imagined a platform that connects producers, the brands, NGOs, consumers, where everybody can insert their inputs. And through the blockchain system, those information would be immutable, would be immediately available from all over the world, and everybody could really contribute and be put on the very same level. So we would also solve the inequality problem, because just by uploading a picture, you would document the conditions of the production side and so on and so forth. And then we realized that this system might also have additional advantages, because having a tag that indicates that a product is really that one, produced in that place with that specific yarn, with that fabric, and so on, is very helpful for tracking counterfeiters and also parallel markets. Second, it could engage consumers, thus increasing consumers' affiliation, because they would be part of that social community that would satisfy somehow our need, as mentioned before, of being part of this social media world that is so pervasive in the modern society. And finally, it can also give a competitive edge to the companies that are actually endorsing this system. And according to the Pulse of the Fashion Industry, that is a report published last year during the Copenhagen Fashion Summit, such kind of innovations concerning sustainability introduced in the fashion industry can unlock $160 billion. So it's not just a matter of being ethical for no reason or just for being kind, but it's a matter of money and of business. So to come to a conclusion, you remember the girl who bought the light blue jacket I told you at the beginning? Well, I hope next year I'll be here telling you the story that she went to the shop and the only problem was to decide whether to pick a light blue jacket or a red one. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a final short presentation by Rosa Stella De Fazio, PhD, University of Naples and also University of Salento. The topic is the international protection of human rights in transnational business activities. So we are in a sort of circular way back to transnational companies and fundamental rights.
Thank you for the floor, Susanna. Well, first I'd like to remark my real interest for this topic of international protection of human rights in transnational business activities, because it's a very actual topic that not only in an academic context, but also in a governmental context. Indeed, I have very recently had the opportunity to deepen my knowledge, my personal knowledge on this topic in the context of some negotiations held by the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs with other governments in very relevant international fora, which I could participate to. But since it's a quite technical topic under the legal point of view, I am glad to do a small legal background about this topic in order to introduce some concepts. At first, I stem from the United Nations Human Rights Council, which in 2014 adopted the resolution 26/9, which still regulates the activities of transnational corporations and other business companies in accordance with international human rights protection systems. The resolution 26/9 aimed at establishing the United Nations open-ended intergovernmental working group, which had and still has the main mandate to elaborate an international legally binding instrument on the responsibilities of transnational corporations and other business companies in the field of human rights. We have to remark that since 2014, so since the adoption of this resolution, more than 200 meetings have been held both at bilateral and multilateral level, not only in Geneva but also in other international fora. And from these meetings, it's relevant to underline the particular dynamism of the process relating to the adoption of a future convention or another juridical international binding instrument, which has emerged from the several sessions of the working groups. In this process, there are two very relevant milestones, which are the two sessions of the working group in 2015 and in 2016. And from this last session of 2016 emerged the publication of the emerged the publication of the elements for a draft legally binding instrument on transnational corporations and other business enterprises with respect to human rights, which has been drafted by the Ecuadorian presidency of the working group on the basis of Article 3 of the resolution. This document is very important because from it emerged the legal basis of the resolution itself, which helps the reader to understand its close connection with respect not only of human rights in general, but also and above all to the rights to development, to the right to life, to the right to a sustainable development, and to the right to work and social security above all. However, there are some controversial aspects of the elements, and above all, the decision to submit to the compliance check of the international human rights protection system only those corporations whose activities could be considered as international, as transnational above all. And on this point, there have been some discussions above all by the European Union External Service and the Commission because of the notion of transnational business activities. And indeed, at the same time of the Ecuadorian position, it has been circulated among governments a non-paper which highlighted the need to extend the protection of human rights also to business activities of national companies, which as comprehending included also small and medium-sized corporations. Above all, because of a major and greater accordance with the European Union legislation and best practice in this domain. So the topic is how the international human rights system could harmonize those very different positions. And because it is a question not only involving a legal and a juridical position, but also a very political question, because involving the foreign policies choices of the European Union member states. And this is also a very problematic question because in the next sessions of the open-ended intergovernmental working groups, member states will have a toll to reach a final position on this topic. And this is very difficult as a final step to join because of the results of the last open-ending working group in 2017, from which the European member states decided to exclude the co-regulation of all companies, and also decided to exclude a panel on the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. So it appears clear that there is a total agreement which could not be reached at this moment, while in the end of 2018 member states have to reach an agreement in view of the adoption of the final convention. So the topic is quite open because maybe in the next few working groups there will be some decision, but it's also a very interesting topic under international law because implying new concept and new reflection which until now had not been part of the discussion. Thank you.